You never count your money when you're sitting at the table. There'll be
Fans in all of country music tonight mourning the passing of Kenny Rodgers. He died today at his home in Sandy Springs, Georgia, at the age of 81.
The 25th of October, 2017, Nashville, Tennessee. A man walks out onto a stage at the Bridgestone Arena for the last time. He is 79 years old, and he has been performing professionally since 1957. He has sold something in the region of 125 million records, which puts him among the best-selling recording artists in the history of the world, and he has come to say goodbye. The building is full. Dolly Parton is there, and she sings with him, and the two of them do Islands in the Stream together in public for the last time. That is the ending most people know about Kenny Rodgers, and it is not what this video is about, because 5 years before that night, he had written a book, and in it, he answered a question that nobody had asked him directly, and the answer surprised a great many people who thought they knew him. 5 people, not the duet partners anybody would guess, not the presidents he sang for, or the film stars, or the executives, or the men who made him rich. Not, in the end, the 5 women he married. 5 names, in his order, drawn out of a memoir he published in 2012 under his own name, while he was alive, in print, and available to be argued with about every word of it. That is a considerably higher standard of evidence than most stories of this kind can manage. And the one at the top of the list is not Dolly Parton. If The Gambler was ever on in your kitchen, a tap of the like button puts him in front of somebody else who remembers it. Kenny Rodgers died on the 20th of March 2020 at his home in Sandy Springs, Georgia. He was 81 years old, he was under hospice care, and the cause given was natural causes. That is where the title of this video comes from, and it needs explaining before anything else. Nobody stood at his bedside taking dictation. There is no deathbed list, no final recorded interview, and no letter opened after the funeral. What there is instead is considerably more reliable than any of those things, and considerably harder to argue with. In 2012, at the age of 74, Kenny Rodgers published an autobiography called Luck, or something like it. He wrote it 8 years before he died, at a point when he had nothing left to prove, no career to protect, and no record to sell that needed protecting either. He would be inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame the following year, in 2013, alongside a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Country Music Association in the same 12 months. He would take a Kennedy Center honor in 2017, and he had been inducted into the Texas Country Music Hall of Fame that same year. He was, in other words, at exactly the stage of life where a man either tells the truth or produces a puff piece to sell at concert merchandise stands, and he chose the first one. There is a version of that book which would have been extremely easy to write in 2012. 60 years of anecdotes, the famous names, the film sets, the White House, the tour stories, and nothing in it that would trouble anybody. It would have sold perfectly well. The book is unusually candid for a country memoir, and country memoirs are not generally a candid form. The standard model is warm, selective, and entirely safe. He takes personal responsibility for the failures of 4 marriages, rather than distributing the blame around the women involved. He writes about his father's alcoholism, and about what he never managed to understand about it. He describes a childhood in a federal housing project in Houston without dressing any of it up or turning it into a parable about hard work. And running through the whole of it are 5 people he keeps coming back to, in the way that a person writing honestly about their own life keeps returning to the same small number of names without particularly meaning to. Every single thing in the next half hour comes from that book, or from interviews he gave under his own name, on the record, with a reporter's name attached. There is no anonymous source anywhere in this video. There is nothing from a friend of the family. He said all of it himself, in public, while he was alive. Which is why the list is worth taking seriously, and why the order of it is worth arguing with. Because the order is the interesting part. Almost anybody who knew his catalog could guess 3 of these 5 names. Almost nobody would put them in the sequence he did, and the 2 at the top are the 2 that a stranger would have placed at the bottom. Starting at 5, number 5, Lionel Richie. In 1980, Kenny Rodgers was already an enormous country star. He had come out of the first edition, he had spent the second half of the 1970s turning himself into one of the biggest solo acts in America, and he had a run of records that a country singer of that era could reasonably retire on. What he did not have was a way out of the category. The success was real, and it had a shape to it, and the shape had walls. Country music in 1980 functioned as a ceiling as much as a home. It sold in enormous numbers to a specific audience in specific parts of the country, and it did not generally cross into the pop mainstream and stay there for any length of time. The artists who managed that could be counted on one hand, and most of them did it once and came back. Rodgers had already tried twice. He had started in a doo-wop group called the Scholars in the 1950s, and had a minor solo hit in 1957 with That Crazy Feeling. He had spent time in a jazz trio. Then he spent the late 1960s in a rock band called The First Edition, whose first hit in 1968 was a piece of psychedelia called Just Dropped In, and which broke up in 1976. So by 1980, he had been a doo-wop singer, a jazz bassist, a psychedelic rocker, and a country star, in that order, across 23 years. He knew exactly what the other side of that fence looked like, and he knew how difficult it was to stand on. Lionel Richie was, at that point, a member of the Commodores. He was a soul and funk musician from Alabama, signed to Motown, playing to an audience that did not overlap with Kenny Rodgers' audience at any point at all. The two of them made a record called Lady, released in 1980. Richie wrote it and he produced it, which meant a Motown songwriter was running a session for a country singer at a point when those two worlds barely acknowledged each other commercially. He played piano on it. Rodgers sang it. The record went to number 1 on the American pop chart and stayed there for 6 weeks, and it went to number 1 on the country chart and the adult contemporary chart at the same time, which is 3 formats at once, from a collaboration that on paper should not have happened at all. It is the biggest solo crossover hit Kenny Rodgers ever had, and he did not write a note of it. And what it did to his career is difficult to overstate. It converted a country star into a global one, more or less overnight, and everything that followed in the 1980s, the arenas, the television specials, the international touring, runs through that single collaboration. But the reason Richie is on this list is not the sales figure. It is that the two of them stayed close for the following 40 years. Rodgers writes about that friendship in the memoir as one of the relationships his life was actually built around, rather than as a business arrangement that happened to work. Consider what that collaboration required of both of them at the time. Richie was risking his standing at Motown to write for a country singer. Rodgers was handing creative control of his biggest opportunity to a man from an entirely different tradition on trust. Neither of them was making the record he was supposed to be making. A Commodore was not supposed to be writing for Nashville, and a country singer was not supposed to be taking direction from Motown. They made it anyway. It worked better than anything either of them had done alone. And then they simply remained friends about it for the following 40 years, through Richie's own enormous solo career in the 1980s, and through everything that happened to both of them afterwards. When Rodgers died in 2020, Richie said publicly that he had lost not just a brother, but a friend, which is a distinction worth noticing. Plenty of people in that business call each other brother. Very few bother to separate the two words. Number 4, Dolly Parton. This is the one everybody expects to be at the top, and there is a strong case for it. The two of them are the most successful duet partnership in the history of country music. They worked together for 40 years, and she was on that Nashville stage with him in October 2017 at the end. The record that made it is Islands in the Stream, released in 1983, and it is the best-selling country duet of all time. And it happened almost entirely by accident. The song was written by Barry Gibb of the Bee Gees, along with his brothers, and Gibb was also producing the album Kenny Rodgers was making at the time, a record called Eyes That See in the Dark, released in 1983. Rodgers went into the studio and sang it. He sang it for 4 days. 4 days is a long time on one song, even by the standards of an album session in 1983. It means take after take after take across most of a working week, with a producer who is not satisfied and a singer who is losing the ability to hear what he is doing. By the end of the fourth day, he had gone completely off it. In his own telling, he turned to Barry Gibb and told him that he did not even like the song anymore, which is the sort of thing a singer says at the end of a week of takes when the whole thing has stopped meaning anything. And Gibb said, "What we need is Dolly Parton." That is the entire origin of the biggest duet in country music history. A man sick of his own record on day 4 and a producer who happened to have the right idea at the right moment. Rodgers described that suggestion for the rest of his life as the mark of a visionary, and it is difficult to argue with the assessment. Parton came in, the record was finished, and Islands in the Stream went to #1 on the American pop chart and #1 on the country chart, and became the best-selling country duet ever recorded, and has stayed that way for more than 40 years. It has been covered, sampled, played at an incalculable number of weddings since 1983, and used ever since as shorthand for the entire decade it came out of. What followed was 4 decades of a working relationship that never soured, which in that business is genuinely rare. Duet partnerships tend to end in accountancy or in silence. They recorded together across the whole of it, and they toured together, and they appeared on each other's television specials for 30 years. Their final duet, You Can't Make Old Friends, came out in 2013, 30 years after the first one, and the title is not remotely subtle about what it is doing or who it is for. When he died in March 2020, Parton said publicly that she had loved him with all her heart, and that their time together on this earth would remain one of the treasures of her life. She has told the 4 days story herself, many times since, and she tells it the same way he did, as a piece of luck that happened to 2 people who were both in the right building on the right Thursday. So a partnership that started because a producer got bored of watching a man sing badly on a Thursday turned into one of the 2 or 3 great friendships of Kenny Rodgers' life, and she is still only number 4. Number 3, Edward Floyd Rodgers, his father. Kenneth Ray Rodgers was born on the 21st of August, 1938, at St. Joseph's Infirmary in Houston, Texas, the 4th of 8 children. The family lived in San Felipe Courts, a federal housing project in Houston's 4th Ward, which was later redeveloped as Allen Parkway Village. They were poor in the specific, unromantic way that families were poor in Texas in that decade. That meant peanut butter sandwiches. It meant 8 children in nowhere near enough rooms. It meant no money at any point for anything that was not strictly essential, in a household where what counted as essential was decided weekly. He was born in 1938, which put his entire childhood inside the tail of the Depression and then the whole of the Second World War. His father, Edward Floyd Rodgers, was born in 1904 and worked as a carpenter, and during the Second World War, he worked in the shipyards. He was also a musician. Not professionally, and not for money. He played fiddle and guitar around the house in the evenings, the way a great many working men in the American South did in the 1940s. And by every account of that household, the reason all 8 of those children ended up playing something is that their father did it first. Rodgers said as much to Rolling Stone decades later. All of his brothers and sisters played an instrument. The first music Kenny Rodgers ever heard came out of his father's hands, in a housing project for free. And Edward Floyd Rodgers was an alcoholic. That is the fact his son led with every single time for the rest of his life. This entry is going to be handled the way Rodgers handled it himself, which is as a story about a love that never got finished, rather than as an exposé about a dead man who cannot answer. Everything in it is his own published account, given in his own name, and none of it is embellished. There are no invented scenes of that household in this video, and there will not be. What he said, decades later and repeatedly, is that one of the real tragedies of his life was that he never got to know why his father drank. He worked out an answer eventually, and the answer he arrived at is a generous one. He came to believe that his father simply could not support his family, 8 children on a carpenter's wages in the 4th Ward, and that the failure broke him down, and that the drinking came out of the failure rather than the other way round. And he said in as many words that it broke his heart not to have understood that before his father died. Edward Floyd Rodgers died in 1975, aged 71. His son was 36 years old at the time and had been working in music for nearly 20 years without ever quite arriving. The first edition had broken up in 1976. The solo career did not take off until 1977 with Lucille, which means the father died about 2 years before any of it happened. He never saw the number ones, or the arenas, or the Hall of Fame, or the 125 million records. The man whose fiddle playing started the whole thing was gone before there was anything to show him. That is the shape of the entry. A man spent the rest of his life trying to understand something he could have asked about while there was still somebody there to ask. There is a conversation Rodgers described that says more about this than any of the rest of it. A friend of his who worked as a marriage counselor noticed something about the way Rodgers talked about his father. Every single time the subject came up, the first thing out of his mouth was that his father was an alcoholic. The friend asked him whether that was really how he saw the man, not as a challenge, as a question about the sentence itself and about why that particular fact was the one arriving first, every single time, 40 years after the funeral. And it is not, and the memoir proves it, because the other thing Rodgers said consistently across years of interviews is that he got his sense of humor from his father and his sense of values from his mother, and that he considered that a great combination to have been handed. He never drank himself, not once by his own account, across 81 years and 6 decades in an industry that runs on it, because of what he had watched happen in a house in the 4th Ward. So the entry holds both things at once and never resolves into one of them. A boy who loved a man he did not understand, who spent the following 60 years quietly working out an explanation for him, who arrived at a generous one, and arrived at it roughly 20 years too late to say it to the person it was about. That is not a tragedy in the dramatic sense. It is the ordinary version, which happens in a very large number of families and almost never gets written down by somebody with a publisher. Number 2. His mother, Lucille Lois Rodgers, born Lucille Hester in 1910, was a nurse's assistant. She worked in a hospital, frequently on night shifts, and she cleaned offices, and she raised 8 children in a housing project on the wrong side of the tracks in Houston while her husband's drinking made the household unreliable. The family was on welfare for a substantial part of Kenny Rodgers' childhood. Hold the arithmetic of that for a moment, because it does not really work. 8 children, night shifts at a hospital, cleaning offices on top of the nursing work, a husband whose income could not be relied upon, and a federal housing project in Houston in the 1940s, which was not somewhere a family planned to raise children so much as somewhere a family ended up when the alternatives ran out. She got all 8 of them through it. Kenny Rodgers became the first member of his family ever to finish high school, graduating from Jefferson Davis High School in Houston in 1956. That is her achievement, at least as much as it is his. 8 children came through that house, and one of them stayed in school long enough to graduate. And the reason there was a house to stay in at all was a woman working nights at a hospital and days cleaning offices. And she gave him one piece of advice which he repeated for the rest of his life. She told him, when he was young, to find a job he loved, and then he would never work a day in his life. His response at the time was that it sounded too good to be true. He went out and tested it. For 60 years, in front of about 125 million record buyers across country and pop and rock and jazz, from a doo-wop group in 1957 to a farewell arena in 2017. That is the whole entry, and it is why she sits at number 2 rather than somewhere further down the list. His father gave him the music and the sense of humor. His mother gave him the single instruction he actually followed, and then kept a household standing long enough for him to follow it. Now, there is a coincidence attached to her name, and this video is going to state it accurately, because the inaccurate version is already circulating. His mother's name was Lucille. and his first solo #1 country record in 1977, the song that finally broke his solo career open after 20 years of trying, is called Lucille. That song was not written about her, and it is important to say so plainly. It was written by Roger Bowling and Hal Bynum, neither of whom knew his mother, and it is about a woman who walks out on a husband and 4 hungry children in a bar in Toledo. Rodgers did not write it and did not choose it for the name. The two facts are simply true at the same time, and the coincidence is genuinely strange, and it is a coincidence. Anybody telling you that Kenny Rodgers named his breakthrough record after his mother is telling you something that is not so. Lucille Lois Rodgers died in 1991 at 81. She lived to see all of it: the gambler, the arenas, the films, the crossover, the whole improbable outcome of a piece of advice she had given a boy in a housing project sometime in the 1940s. Her husband saw none of it, and she saw every bit. Number 1. Wanda Miller. They met in the 1990s in a restaurant in Atlanta, and the circumstances of that meeting are almost too neat to be true, which is generally a warning sign, except that he told it himself and told it consistently for 20 years. Kenny Rodgers was there for a blind date. The blind date was with somebody else. And while he was there, he noticed the woman working in the restaurant, and a few days later, he telephoned the place and asked about her. He was in his late 50s. She was in her late 20s. There were 28 years between them, and the practical consequence of that gap is the detail that makes it real rather than abstract. Wanda Miller's parents were younger than the man who wanted to marry their daughter. They were not initially enthusiastic about the arrangement, which is about as understandable a position as a parent has ever taken. It took time. It worked out. They married on the 1st of June, 1997. He was 58. It was his 5th marriage. The previous 4 ran from 1958 to 1993 and produced 3 children between them: Carol in 1960, Kenny Jr. in the 3rd marriage, and Christopher in 1982. None of the 4 lasted, and the longest of them ran 16 years. That number matters because of what he said about the previous 4. In the memoir and in interviews around it, Rodgers took the responsibility for those marriages onto himself rather than distributing it. His own diagnosis was that he was driven rather than selfish, and that the distinction had probably not made much practical difference to the women who had to live with it. Which is what makes his account of the 5th marriage considerably more interesting than a standard piece of late-life romantic sentiment. A man who has publicly accepted the blame for 4 failed marriages does not have much credibility left to spend on the 5th one. Anything he says about it is going to be weighed against the record. He said it anyway. He said Wanda was truly his soulmate. He said she knew him better than anyone ever had. He called her the love of his life in public, repeatedly, in a way that a man on his 5th marriage generally has the sense not to do. And then, on the 6th of July, 2004, in Atlanta, Wanda gave birth to twin sons, Justin Charles and Jordan Edward. There is a small piece of family symmetry in that. Wanda is an identical twin herself, and twins run on the Rodgers side as well. 2 of his own siblings were twins. Kenny Rodgers was 65 years old. He had 3 grown children already, from 3 previous marriages, the eldest of whom had been born in April 1960, 44 years before the twins arrived. He was a grandfather-aged man walking out of a delivery room in Atlanta in July 2004 with 2 newborn boys. He made a joke about it at the time, and the joke is the single most revealing line in this entire video. He said that having twins at his age would either make him or break him, and he said he was leaning towards break. That is a man doing arithmetic out loud. A 65-year-old holding 2 babies knows exactly what the numbers are. He knows what age he will be when they start school, and when they finish it, and he knows the odds on being at the second one. He said the funny version because the other version could not be said out loud in a room with reporters in it. The other version is that a man of 65 looking at 2 newborns is looking at an arithmetic problem with a fixed answer, and that no amount of money or fame or health does anything at all to change the sum. And here is what he did about it. Kenny Rodgers retired. He announced the farewell in 2015 and spent 2 years on a final tour, and then played that last Nashville show in October 2017 at the age of 79. The reason he gave, repeatedly and without embellishment, was that he wanted to be at home with his wife and his boys while there was still time to be there. Consider what he was actually walking away from. He was still selling tickets. He was still capable of filling an arena, which the Bridgestone that night proved. The offers do not stop coming for a man with that catalog, and the money on the table for a performer of his standing at that age is considerable. He stopped anyway, and he stopped early enough to get almost 3 years at home. He said he had never seen a better mother than Wanda. He said she knew him better than anyone, and in the end, he stopped doing the thing he had been doing since 1957, which is the same thing his mother had told him to find and never stop doing, because the two people at the top of his list needed him in the house more than the stage needed him on it. He died on the 20th of March, 2020. The twins were 15 years old. He got 2.5 years. The twins were 15 when he died, and 11 when he came off that stage in Nashville, which means the retirement bought him roughly the last stretch of their childhood. So look at the 5 of them together, because the shape of that list is the point of this video. A collaborator from a different genre who wrote him a song. A duet partner suggested by a producer on the 4th day of a session that had gone stale. A carpenter he loved and never understood. A nursing assistant who kept 8 children alive in a housing project. And a woman 28 years younger than him whom he met because a blind date with somebody else was not going well. Not one of them is a person Kenny Rodgers set out to acquire. There is no strategy anywhere in that list. Nobody on it was cultivated, courted professionally, or added because of what they could do for a career. That is the thing the list actually reveals, and it is the opposite of what 125 million records would lead anybody to expect. This was a driven man. He said so himself. He built a career across 6 decades with enormous deliberateness, and he was frank about what that cost the people who were married to him along the way. And when he sat down at 74 to write about who mattered, every single name he produced was somebody who arrived in his life sideways. 4 of the 5 he did not choose at all. 2 of them were his parents. One was suggested by Barry Gibb. One came out of a restaurant he was in for another reason entirely. There are no executives anywhere on that list. No label bosses, no managers, no producers except Barry Gibb, who appears only as the man who made a suggestion about somebody else. No presidents, and he sang for several of them. No film stars, and he made films. No other artists besides the 2 who happened to become friends. No mentors, no rivals, and nobody at all from the business side of a business he spent 60 years at the top of. The most driven man in country music produced a list composed almost entirely of accidents. The twins are in their 20s now, born in July 2004. They were 15 when their father died in March 2020, and they are grown men, and they have already spent a stretch of their lives without him that most people that age have not had to. Wanda outlived him and has stayed almost entirely out of public view since. Dolly Parton is still working, and still telling the story about the 4 days and Barry Gibb, and still saying she loved him. And the records are exactly where he left them in 2017. The Gambler is on the radio somewhere in the world this week. Islands in the Stream is at a wedding. Lady is in a supermarket, and Lucille, which is not about his mother, is on a jukebox in a bar somewhere in Texas, about 400 miles from a housing project in the 4th Ward, where a nursing assistant on night shifts told a boy to go and find work he loved. He tested it for 60 years, across 5 marriages, 8 decades, a doo-wop group in 1957, and a farewell arena in 2017, and 125 million records sold in between. It turned out she was right. And the last thing he did with the career she pointed him at was put it down at 79 so that he could go home to the 2 people at the top of his list while there was still time to be there. If this is the sort of thing worth half an hour, there is more of it on the channel every week.